In the deserts and canyons of the American West, a new sun rose before dawn on July 16, 1945. It was not the sun that warms crops or dries laundry on backyards. It was an engineered star. Flash, heat, and shock whipped into a brief existence by equations chalked on blackboards and by thousands of hands that turned wrenches, machined metals, and sealed high explosives with ritual care. They called it Trinity. Newspapers did not. Many of the people who saw the light on distant horizons would spend the rest of their lives wondering what exactly it had done to them. The Manhattan Project is usually told as a saga of genius and urgency. Scientists fleeing fascism, laboratories hidden in mesas, secret towns conjured on federal land, and a race against a regime that had already murdered millions. It ends, in this version, with 2 mushroom clouds over Japan and a forced peace that rewrote geopolitics. But there is another story braided through the first, quieter and longer. It begins earlier than Trinity and continues decades after the soldiers came home. It is the story of hidden fallout, of downwinders and test site workers, of uranium miners and millers, of sailors and soldiers, of islanders in the Pacific, of medical experiments, of secrecy, uncertainty, and the strange half-light where science and policy meet human bodies. Secrecy was the first condition. Before there was a bomb, there was a plan that demanded silence. The project's architects chose remote places with sparse populations precisely because fewer eyes could see and fewer voices could ask questions. At Los Alamos, the scientists brought their families. Their children played hopscotch under ponderosa pines while their parents debated neutron reflectors. At Hanford, reactors rose along the Columbia River to breed plutonium. The site sat on a land once crowded with salmon and tribal economies, now guarded by barbed wire and armed patrols. At Oak Ridge, a city of collutrons and racetracks separated isotopes with magnetic fields so strong that needles twitched in nearby barbershops. Each site birthed routines, security passes, compartmentalized memos, code names. In the middle of it all, men and women did their jobs. In the years to come, many would wonder exactly what those jobs had done to them. Trinity turned theoretical risk into empirical fact. The fireball sheared the dawn with a light that observers described as whiter than any white, followed by a muffled roar that rolled through the Jornada del Muerto basin like a slow animal. The steel tower on which the device had rested was simply gone, its legs puddled into radioactive green glass later nicknamed Trinitite. The desert wind had its say. Debris lofted into the sky and then descended, not on a tidy circle, but along serpentine paths determined by temperature inversions, shears, and the moods of a summer atmosphere. Fallout is not poetry. It is a mixture of particles and vapors, some hot for minutes, others for decades, carried by air, gathered by gravity, rinsed by rain, and trapped by lungs, soil, and skin. In the days after Trinity, ranchers found strange ash on fence posts. Some schoolchildren who had watched the light later recalled the taste of metal on their tongues. There were no door-to-door explanations. There were no pamphlets in Spanish for Hispanic families who lived and worked downwind. People were left with rumors and the confidence of the federal government that everything was under control. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not tests. They were the culminating use of the Manhattan Project's logic. The human beings beneath those mushroom clouds experienced heat sufficient to fuse roof tiles, pressure enough to blow lungs, and neutron rains that seeded marrow with long-term harm. The immediate death toll was immense. The longer arc included survivors with burns that healed into keloid patterns resembling maps of suffering, children born to irradiated parents with higher rates of certain illnesses, and an entire society learning the vocabulary of atomized trauma. The geopolitical story, Japan's surrender, the Cold War's opening, shared the front page with a quieter ledger. Doctors and physicists meeting survivors, counting blood cells, drawing invisible lines between dose and effect. Back in the United States, the nuclear project did not wind down. It accelerated. The plutonium that had destroyed Nagasaki was made in reactors. More reactors, therefore, meant more bombs, more deterrence, more perceived security. Hanford expanded. Oak Ridge diversified. New labs sprouted at Sandia and Livermore, where weapons designers iterated designs like engineers in a grim startup, seeking fuses that would not fail and cores that would not pre-initiate. The doctrine of deterrence demanded reliability. Reliability demanded testing. Testing demanded land, water, and air. Thus, the Nevada Proving Grounds, later the Nevada Test Site, joined the map of places where the atom would be persuaded to disclose its limits. Testing culture developed its own rituals. Officials issued press releases about scheduled events. Dignitaries watched from bleachers as towers disappeared into domes of dust. Photographers framed the moment when the fireball became a flower. But beyond the chain link and checkpoint, the blast did not ask for consent. It rolled across ranches, schools, and small towns where families hung laundry on lines and where children loved Saturday matinees. Fallout did not respect county lines. It followed winds that, in some seasons, dragged columns of radioactive particles eastward, sometimes in narrow bands, sometimes as hazes that later settled on snow and roofs. Measurements were taken, but they were not widely shared. Farmers wrote to county agents to ask why their sheep had sickened. Mothers asked doctors about nosebleeds. The answers were often benign, not because all was truly well, but because institutions were not yet ready to admit that their instruments could not keep danger inside the fence. Downwinders is the name many later chose for themselves. The word suggests a passive geography, as if people simply happened to be where the wind wanted them. In reality, they were rooted there by work and love. Navajo families whose livelihood included sheep and ceremonies. Mormon communities that prized large families and close ties. Hispanic ranchers who measured days by chores, not by gamma counts. Their stories are not uniform. Some remember sickness clustering like dark grapes on a vine, thyroid cancers and cousins, leukemias and neighbors, autoimmune disorders that doctors struggled to name. Others recall decades of robust health. Epidemiology is music played in statistics, not a single violin. To hear it, one must gather large cohorts, estimate doses, control for confounders, and admit uncertainty. But uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. There were patterns that demanded explanation, iodine isotopes that drifted onto grass, into cow's milk, and then into children's thyroids, hotspots where rainfall scrubbed radioactivity from air to pasture, time series that showed specific test seasons followed by specific disease spikes years later. The conversation grew louder. It would take politics to make it audible in Washington. The uranium life cycle extends the shadow. Weapons and reactors do not grow fuel on trees. Miners and millers wrest it from rock. In the Southwest, the uranium boom of the 1940s and 1950s brought jobs to places that had endured long neglect. Navajo men descended into shafts. Some were told the dust was harmless. Others asked for masks and were told they were unnecessary. Radon gas, the daughter of uranium decay, pooled in poorly ventilated tunnels. Its progeny played it out on bronchial linings and delivered microbursts of alpha radiation to cells that could not feel them but would remember them in mutations years later. Many miners developed lung cancers at rates far above national norms. Widows testified to Congress. The company said they had followed the rules of their time. The families asked why the rules had been written without them. At Hanford, thermal plumes from reactors warmed the Columbia, and effluents moved through piping and ponds designed to allow isotopes to settle before water re-entered the river. The design was better than nothing and worse than safety. Releases occurred, some planned, some accidental. Clouds of iodine and xenon drifted. Strontium and cesium found their way into sediments and up the trophic ladder. Fishermen noticed fewer salmon. Tribes whose diets and cultures intertwined with the river experienced changes that could not be neatly plotted on a scientist's graph. Environmental health is not only a number, it is a felt relation to land and water. The message that levels are within acceptable limits rarely speaks to people whose idea of acceptable is spiritual and ancestral. On the East Coast, at Oak Ridge, the combination of chemical industry and nuclear work layered hazards. Workers who handled solvents, mercury, and radionuclides were subject to monitoring programs whose thoroughness varied by era and job classification. Some records were meticulous, others were lost or never kept. In later lawsuits, what plaintiffs wanted more than money was recognition, that the strange cancer that took a husband or the fibrosis that stole a mother's breath were not random lightning, but part of a storm organized by policy choices made far away. Recognition is a form of medicine. It does not reverse pathology, but it can restore coherence to a life narrative wrenched by bureaucratic denials. The Pacific test added a different register of harm. The Marshall Islands endured blasts that rivaled small suns. Bravo, in 1954, exceeded its predicted yield. Islanders watched a snow of ash drift down, curious at first, then alarmed as skin reddened and hair fell out. U.S. personnel stationed downwind experienced unexpected exposures. Some sailors recall washing decks coated in white grit. Bikini and Eniwetok became place names that, for many Americans, signified only swimsuits and trivia. For islanders, they signified exile. Some were relocated for their safety, then relocated again when lands deemed safe were discovered to be less so. Generations later, communities still navigate the aftermath: contaminated soils, dietary shifts from traditional foods to processed imports, and the psychological burden of knowing that the ground remembers what the maps forgot. Secrecy shaped the medical story as well. Radiation is not visible, but science has made it legible. Dosimeters click, film badges blacken, scintillation counters sparkle. Yet instruments are only as honest as the systems that deploy them. In hospitals and universities, plutonium and other radionuclides were administered to some patients without fully informed consent, part of a broader mid-century medical culture that sometimes treated subjects as means rather than ends. The justification was often couched in national security or in the pursuit of knowledge that could calibrate safety for workers and troops. The ethical reckoning came later, in panels and reports that tried to balance context against harm. Balancing is not forgiveness. It is an acknowledgement that bright lines were crossed and grays that institutions had painted themselves. The legal reckoning arrived with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, an attempt, limited but real, to compensate downwinders, uranium workers, and certain test participants for specific cancers and illnesses linked to defined periods and locations. The law did not heal, but it paid bills. It did not settle every argument. Indeed, it created new ones as communities just outside the eligible counties asked why geography should decide justice, but it recognized that the nation's nuclear achievements had domestic costs borne disproportionately by people far from the rooms where strategies were debated. Policy is always a choice about who will bear risk for whose benefit. Rike made that sentence visible in statute. Hidden fallout is not only medical or legal, it is also cultural. For decades, American popular culture celebrated the bomb with a kind of dazzled fear. Atomic cocktails, atomic cars, atomic age architecture, optimism and neon. Underneath, unease hummed. Film noir borrowed laboratory lighting to throw hard shadows. Comics imagined mutants saved by heroism. Science fiction set apocalypses on familiar streets. The Nevada test site offered tours where visitors could watch atomic blasts from safe distances, as if nature had added a new spectacle to the desert. But even spectacles cast long shadows. Photographers who captured perfect symmetrical mushrooms also captured scarred landscapes, subsidence craters, and houses blasted to splinters for data. The American West is a palimpsest, geologies written by plate tectonics, indigenous geographies inscribed by migration and ceremony, homesteader grids, and then, in the 20th century, the strange, precise footprints of weapons development. Science, for its part, evolved. Health physics matured from a craft into a discipline. Dosimetry improved, models of internal emitters refined risk projections, thyroid screenings grew more sensitive, bone-seeking isotopes were tracked with biokinetics that married calculus to clinical observation. The same knowledge that helped build bombs also helped refine safety. That duality is not a moral loophole, it is an enduring feature of powerful tools. The question remains, who decides acceptable exposure? In normal workplaces, consensus forms through regulation, labor negotiation, and litigation. In national security spaces, the asymmetry is steeper. Workers sign non-disclosure agreements. Citizens accept explanations filtered through classification. This is not always sinister. Secrecy can protect. But protection without accountability creates a moral vacuum. Into that vacuum creep rumors, conspiracy theories, and also true stories delayed by red stamps and storage boxes. The Manhattan Project's hidden fallout includes psychological states that do not have ICD codes. Families that mistrust doctors because the first 5 said nothing was wrong. Communities that debate among themselves about whether speaking up will threaten the one large employer in town. Elders who remember a time when the government built roads and schools and also built something no one was supposed to see. Children who grew up with the background radiation of adult silence. In such conditions, even well-designed public health studies can feel like foreign visitors with clipboards, extracting data and leaving. Trust is a slow chemistry. It is made from transparency, longitudinal relationships, and the humility to admit when the evidence cannot deliver headline clarity. There is a temptation to tell this story as prosecution or as defense, but history rarely works as a courtroom where the verdict erases complexity. The bomb ended a war and began an era. It deterred some nightmares and created others. It mobilized brilliance and institutionalized secrecy. It produced jobs that lifted some families into middle-class stability, and it produced exposures that lifted some cancers into hospital wards. It remade geology with glass, made treaties with language that tried to contain blast radii in words, and left behind places that will need stewardship longer than any dynasty has yet managed to rule. None of these sentences cancels the next. The point is not to balance the books to zero. It is to read them honestly. An honest reading includes names, miners whose lungs gave way too soon, machinists who handled beryllium and spent years puzzling over their breath, widows who learned to explain the technical term for their husband's disease to clerks, ranchers who wondered why their sheep miscarried after a particular spring storm. Marshallese elders who teach stories about relocations that tasted of loss and salt. Technicians who, decades later, still talk about the sound the reactor made when a pump seized. Nurses who remember sudden flares of leukemia cases and the way the ward smelled at night. Physicists who believed, with good reason, that they had helped deter a war that would have killed many more. Engineers who felt pride in well-made instruments and who also felt the ache of knowing some readings would never be declassified in their lifetimes. These lives are not footnotes, they are the ink. If there is a moral here, it is not a slogan. It is a discipline. Never separate means from ends so thoroughly that the body carrying the means disappears. National security is a legitimate end. So is deterrence, so is scientific curiosity. But the Manhattan Project's hidden fallout shows that ends pursued at the speed of fear can outrun the slow institutions of consent. Repair begins when institutions slow down enough to listen to those who bore the risk they assigned. Repair continues when data is shared plainly, when compensation is administered without labyrinths, and when the story told in schools includes not only the triumph of engineering, but the ledger of consequence. The future keeps returning as a question. Nuclear energy remains an option on the table for a world that must decarbonize or invite climate catastrophe. New reactors promise safer designs, passive cooling, and fuel cycles less hospitable to weapons. Advocates speak of clean baseload power. Critics point to costs, timelines, and waste. The Manhattan Project is not to blame for this debate, but it haunts it. Trust, again, is the crucial variable. Communities asked to host new facilities will ask, rightly, whether the oversight today is stronger than yesterday's, whether the worker protections are transparent, whether the economic benefits are real and shared, and whether contingency plans are written in language that ordinary people can read. In desert basins and along green rivers, and libraries and courtrooms, the documentation of the 20th century's most consequential scientific project continues to be read and reread. Some pages still carry redactions, others have yellowed in their boxes. Oral histories fill gaps that paper never captured. The story does not end. It settles, like dust, into new layers of understanding each time a family tells a child why their grandfather left the reservation to follow a rumor of uranium, or why their grandmother saved clippings about a test with a name that sounded like a cartoon but came with a win that tasted wrong. It settles in the way a country decides, each decade, how to balance what it can do with what it should do. Hidden fallout is not mystical. It is administrative and personal, legal and medical. It is the distance between a test announced in a desert and a diagnosis announced in a clinic. It is the time, often years, between exposure and effect, during which institutions reorganize, names on letterheads change, and records migrate from one storage room to another. It is the human habit of wanting to believe that the people in charge know exactly what they are doing, and the equally human lesson that sometimes they do not. It is a mother marking a calendar when her child's nosebleed started. It is a physicist drawing a curve that crosses a confidence interval. It is a senator running a hearing, a journalist asking a question, A community organizer booking a church basement for a meeting, a doctor looking at a pathology slide and thinking of a mine shaft 1,000 miles away. The Manhattan Project remade the world in an instant, and then kept remaking it, slower, quieter, longer. We live in the inheritance. To be worthy heirs is to remember not only the day the new sun rose, but the evenings that followed, when people stepped outside, smelled the wind, and did not yet know that it carried something more than summer.